All right, guys, welcome to Ask Lee Anything, where it is really your show of whatever you want to ask. And please like, subscribe, add all that fun stuff. And if you find value in this, hopefully you will watch the next one. So what do we want to talk about today? The question here is, there are a lot of questions about the condition of the property. And not only are we talking roof, we're talking about pool and easements and other items. So the first word that comes to mind is contingencies. Right. All offers have contingencies. If we understand this, which I know you do, the next word that comes to mind is representation. How do we represent the buyer, right, our client? And so what we would want to do first is, what are the concerns? So in this case, we have a couple concerns. What are they? Roof?
The roof is the main one.
No. Give me all of the concerns.
The fence.
Roof, fence,
Sprinkler system.
sod,
Go over where
okay,
it's ripped up, the backyard, basically.
grass. All of these seem valid, right? So the first thing we want to do is get clarity. So there's one, there's two, here is number three, and this is number four. The first conversation would be with the listing agent and say, hey, the buyer is very concerned about the roof. You, the seller, the listing agent, told you about the fence. Right? They said, hey, we're going to do this. Yeah. So what I heard you say is that there's already been conversation with these items. Right. Okay. So then what we would do is we would write verbiage in the contract, right, that makes it legally binding that the seller finishes these items. Right. Okay. And that's what we would do. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as the roof, I would have a conversation with the listing agent and say, insurance is going to be near impossible with a roof at its life expectancy. Not to mention, we are in the middle of hurricane season. And so our offer will be contingent upon our ability to, one, get insurance. The price at which we offer is absolutely going to be contingent on if the buyer has to replace the roof. Right. What are your thoughts? Now, that's the two parts of this. Okay, so we have two parts of this entire offer. The first is, hey, we have an inspection contingency. What is the name of the inspection contingency? Right to inspect and right to cancel. It is an as-is contract. However, the buyer has right to inspect. We absolutely have the right to have a professional inspector go out to the property. And we have the right to cancel in a period of time. It could be 5 days, it could be 10 days, it could be 14 days. We get to decide what that contingency is. I would make it as long as possible when you represent the buyer, especially if we know that there's scenarios here. Right. Now, we're still talking about number one. We're not talking about these. Okay? So if it's as is, right to inspect and right to cancel, then what we're going to do is, if we choose 10 days, right, buyer and seller agree on 10 days, and we find out that the roof is not satisfactory to the buyer, well, then one of three things can happen. The buyer can take it as is. The seller can repair it and or provide money for it, or the buyer backs out and keeps their escrow. And so that's the conversation that I would have up front. All of this is part of this. Now, again, the obstacle is if The roof is at its life expectancy getting insurance,
Yeah.
binding insurance. So yeah, the seller can come down in price. The seller can remedy, fix it. The seller can give concessions at closing.
Right, there was talk about that. Correct.
Sure, everything is an option here. Everything is an option. Then the second part is that all of this is built into the contract.
Right.
And I would connect with their attorney on the best way to write it, or Ariana at Harbor Title to write the best way to protect the buyer in assuring that this is completed prior to closing.
Right.
Because if it's not, then the buyer isn't forced to close. If this isn't in there, the seller can say, I didn't say anything. And the buyer would be forced to close or be out of contract. So we would say something to the effect of, in absolute clear definition of what fence means,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly how you were describing it. There is, of the east side of the, you would want to get into as detailed as possible. Subject to sprinkler system being in working order within 10 days of closing, which would mean that we would go out there and it would be satisfactory to the buyer that the sprinkler system is working 10 days before closing. And I'm making up the time frame. And then that the sod and grass is up to buyer satisfaction. Now, again, I would refer to an attorney to get the actual, like, legally binding verbiage, but it would be something to that effect. You represent a buyer.
Right.
Nobody's friends in this game.
No, for sure.
So you write contracts to protect the asset of the buyer, which would be moving forward here. So no matter what this agent says or what the seller says, we're going to get a professional inspector out there with a focus on the condition of the roof, the age of the roof, the wind mitigation satisfactory of the roof, and having the conversation first and foremost of where we're going to land on purchase price, concessions, or adjustment of purchase price, or the buyer backs out.
Right.
And the buyer has every right to back out in this time frame. So I would not do 5 days.
No.
I would go somewhere.
We have 7 right now. but
I
we
would
have
go
7.
somewhere between here. And then you would want to talk to the title company the moment you go under contract to confirm what these days mean. Always. That's why it's very important that you team up with a title company that will protect you as an agent, and they'll help you with the dates. Okay? And then 2 to 3 days before, depending on how intense the negotiations are, you're going to want to start working on an extension if you're not there with a satisfactory condition of negotiation. Because you can't go up to the 10th day and then expect to not have drama.
Right.
You would want to send a cancellation on day 9 if we're miles apart, or an extension. Based on where are we? Like, what are we waiting on? Are we waiting on the seller? Then let's extend 2 days. Are we waiting on a quote? Right? What are we extending 2 days if we don't know what that really looks like? But it's really all communication. Is everybody aligned on what the end goal is? And then as far as, let's say that the roof becomes real drama, I've always been a fan of getting 3 quotes. So seller gets a quote, buyer gets 2 quotes, and then we discuss all 3. That way the seller doesn't feel that we're taking advantage of them, and because they get their own quote, and then we can find somewhere with a happy medium in between. All right, what else we got? All right, let's write those out first. Commission, concession, got it. Right now, before August 17th, when we list the property, in the listing agreement, there is a cooperating agent, a co-op agent. So when we take a listing at, let's use 6%, we cooperate 3% with an agent who brings a buyer, and we close. Right?
Correct.
Perfect. This, by definition, is cooperation and compensation because we earn a commission. Okay? So, as far as I understand, that doesn't have to change. That is still able to move forward. We can still offer a commission to a cooperating agent, which is compensation to the cooperating agent, and we're cooperating with another broker. What's changing, Larry, what's changing is we can't advertise this in the multiple listing service. That's what's...
Why do we take out the word concession and replace it with compensation?
Because there's a place for this, and I'm going to explain that next. Okay? So first pillar in this, the first pillar is that we can still offer commission, which is compensation to a cooperating broker.
Okay.
It just cannot be advertised in the multiple listing service. Let me get to concession now for you. One of three things, the way I look at this, one of three things is going to be a reality in representing a buyer. One of three things. Number one, status quo, which is what we just discussed. There is a cooperating commission which you will have clarity on prior to showing the property. Number two, the seller has advised their listing broker to request that the buyer agent's compensation be part of the offer. That the buyer's agent's compensation is to be part of the offer. So for example, full price offer, we will cooperate with 3%. Anything under, commission is varied. And option number three, seller is not offering any cooperation, any compensation. With numbers 2 and number 3, it is imperative that the buyer agent, the person representing the buyer, has a conversation with the buyer of what will happen if option 2 or option 3 comes into play. So number 2 is when the buyer agent's compensation is now subject to the offer. That can be remedied. This can all be remedied as long as we have a buyer-broker agreement executed, signed by both the buyer and us, with absolute clarity as to what it will cost for the buyer to be represented by the agent. If we are under an understanding that for us to work together, I will perform task A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and buyer sees the value of those, that we agree that this will be compensation of 3%. So, for example, if we are buying a $500,000 property, the buyer is in full understanding that they see value of our tasks, our expertise, our systems, that they are willing to compensate at closing. The buyer is willing to compensate $15,000. That has to be agreed upon prior to showing any property. Because option 2 and option 3 are real possibilities. And again, those were that the compensation getting paid is going to be part of the offer, subject to negotiation, or the seller is not offering any compensation whatsoever. So therefore, the buyer has to be in full agreement that they are willing to cooperate with or work with you, and they understand the value of $15,000. Correct. If there is what is status quo today, which is there is cooperation that the buyer's agent feels whole. So now, Larry, I'm going to pivot to what a concession would do. So if the seller says, or the listing agent says, that seller is willing to pay commission, but it has to be part of the offer. Well, that would be a concession. The seller is conceding. That's what a concession is. They are conceding part of their proceeds to help the buyer cover some of this or all of it. We have to juggle this.
Right.
So I had this conversation with one of our agents on Friday, and it was a $7 million property. And so what I had her, the conversation I had was disclose the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is that the seller is not willing to cooperate at all, and what your commission is. And so that has to be the threshold at which the buyer is willing to offer, knowing that the seller is not offering compensation. So in other words, we're not going to give the seller full ask. We're going to be under based off the fact that the buyer has to pay for compensation. And that's the way we have to do this going forward, is that the conversation has to be made up front as to what a worst case scenario is, and that we can't offer highest, because if we did, then you would be paying, in this example, $15,000 more than you feel comfortable. And so, Larry, that's how different this is now. We have to now go to the worst case scenario and say to the buyer, hey, if you wanted to offer $500, well, remember, there's $15,000 of an extra closing cost. That's exact. The highest this buyer should offer is $485, which is where we go back to the seller saying make it part of the offer. So if the seller says, I'll pick up $7,000 of it, then the buyer can go up to $492,500 or something like that. And that's what I mean by it's part of the offer. We start negotiating it, because now the buyer is getting a loan at $515, and they're wrapping in the $15,000 into the total purchase, which is okay, because the seller isn't getting $515. The seller is getting $500 because they're wrapping it into the purchase. 1,000%. Two different conversations that can now be part of the same conversation. And so how do you get ahead of that? Well, you would get ahead of that by, in your consultation with your buyer, and you would say, hey, if we go up against multiple offers, we have a buyer-broker agreement.
Right.
And what we can do is ask the seller to pay for a portion, and it'll be just a closing cost for you of an extra 0.5% or a 1%. So in this example, 1% is $5,000 in this example. So buyer, we'll just ask the seller to pay for 2% commission, and you will have an extra closing cost of $5,000. That's exactly how that scenario would work. Or we don't ask for any concession or compensation from the seller, and buyer know that there will just be a $15,000 expense to represent you and get us to the finish line. Which, mind you, this entire conversation is our value. Our ability to navigate this is our value. Just know, like, this is real. Like, this ability to navigate is 100% part of how we earn more of this. The highest that we would submit, knowing, and we would say that to the seller and say, this is the highest that we're willing to offer. Anything higher, it would be because you're cooperating with our broker.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly how we would have that conversation. And then your ability to connect those dots of, hey, buyer, understand that since we're in this example, there's $15,000 of representation, we'll just disclose to the seller that this is the highest that we're willing to go based on the fact that we have to concede. In that case, it's a cash offer, right?
Yeah.
At $7 million, and so it's just black and white.
Oh, it's fine.
When there's financing, we can get concessions, which is, as you just pointed out, doing something like this. Sweet, that was fun. Larry, great questions. And your ability to navigate this, everyone's ability to navigate this, but Larry has a lot more experience of the realities of where we are, of as status quo to the new school or the new way that this is going. Yes, you can say, hey, I'm bringing this up because a meteorite hit the industry and we all survived, and yet life as we know it in real estate sales will never be the same. And yet we have a great opportunity to get maximum exposure, which is not changing anything. Really, the only thing that changes is I have to respond to everyone who asks, and it would be my pleasure to scream from the mountaintop that we are cooperating as we have forever with offering 3% to every single person who decides to bring an offer, and we can negotiate a fair price. Well, that's what I would say to bring it up without them suggesting it.
Okay.
Now, should they say, hey, should we offer any money to, do we have to? Well, that's then where, Larry, I would have the homework done and talk about what your competition is offering. So we're going to have to do our homework and say, these are our competition in our neighborhood, and each one of them are offering cooperation of blank, 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 and blank. Let's remain competitive and offer a competitive amount of 3%. Great question. So the first two forms that the state released were cooperation with the seller and cooperation compensation with the listing broker. So you would request those forms, which will show what cooperation is being offered. I don't know that the agreement changes. That's what Larry asked. I don't know that your agreement changes because you just can't disclose the cooperation. So I don't know that it changes or that you have to get a new agreement signed. I would like to think that it's it just continues. You just now have to disclose compensation through the documents that the Florida Association of Realtors shared. No, it cannot be in the multiple listing service. So no, it cannot be in the attachments. So everyone's going to have to come up with a system at which you're able to disclose systematically and easily.
I know.
That sounds
Yes,
okay.
we want to stay in control of our presentation and acknowledge that it's important to them. Assure that we will absolutely have them feel comfortable and confident that they know that they feel comfortable and confident that we will address it and talk about it. And what Larry's referring to is that the presentation doesn't go sideways. It doesn't get derailed. And that they feel comfortable that we are going to address it, that we will talk about it, and based on our presentation, it may already get answered. And yet if it doesn't, we'll make sure that it's answered then. Yes, Larry. So yes. What you're saying is that we're going to get maximum exposure because every buyer, not only the ones that can afford it, will be able to put an offer in on our property. We're going to see what our competition, like part of my homework is to disclose what our competition is doing. And so here's comp number 1, here's comp number 2, here's comp number 3. And remember that I'm breaking script. We, in today's market, we want to price off of the actives, the active listings, and we want to be the lowest active listing based on condition, of course. Based on condition. If this home is priced at $500 and it needs a gut job, but it's the lowest active in the neighborhood, clearly we're not going to price at $500. We're going to price higher than $500, but we're going to look at what the other 2 properties are in the same neighborhood or in the correct comparable vicinity per a CMA model, a comparative market analysis model, and we're going to price off of the lowest comparable so that we are the next property that sells. And then yes, we want to see what our competition, these properties, are offering so that we can remain competitive. And as you said, Larry, absolutely, the buyers are used to having the seller, not having to have this as a closing cost. The buyers are used to not adding more closing costs, and that prices out a large portion of the entry buyer or the first-time buyer. And another way of looking at this, and it's not going to be popular opinion, but another way of looking at this is that we have gained unbelievable equity over the last 14 years. The bottom of the real estate market in South Florida was 2009. And so what we're doing is we're taking 3% of the equity and continuing to offer it to get maximum exposure. Our competition is doing it. And yes, there is a class action lawsuit that gives the seller an option to make it part of the offer. And yet, let's get maximum exposure. It will also provide the buyer's agent skin in the game to keep the deal together should any of the contingencies be questioned. I always err on the side of disclosure, disclosure, disclosure.
You got it.
100%. Transparency wins the game. Communication wins the game. And we're not making anything up here. The buyer's used to paying it. If there are listings that don't offer cooperation, what benefit does the buyer's agent have? And if we don't offer it and the buyer has to pay it, they're not going to give top dollar in today's market because it's just a factor. Now, as the market turns in the next cycle, it's a different conversation. But right now, as this takes hold, Buyers are not going to be prepared in mass to to compensate their representation. Home buyers are not going to be conditioned to compensate their representation, and it will become part of every offer, especially in the lower price points for first-time home buyers who may not have the capital, to be represented. And so doing our best as listing agents to provide the space of cooperation with a buyer broker is a best practice.